is going on, everyone? Darkside Phil here, and welcome to another edition of the Hateful Truth video game review series. Today we're going to be talking about a game that I think is a little bit polarizing. I think for some intents and purposes this is probably a game that's actually better for gameplay itself, meaning you playing the game, than possibly watching it. A game that actually is a sequel to a game that was not very well received from a couple of years back, and I think a lot of people were interested to see, was this game going to be any good? It kind of went under the radar, to be completely honest. Many people have said that they didn't even know this game was out until they heard me mentioning it, or saying that I was even going to do a playthrough of it. And so let's talk a little bit about it so you can get an idea about the game and if you like it. And the game is Blades of Time. Published by Konami, but actually designed by a studio called, if you believe it, I don't know if it's pronounced Gaijin or Gaijin. I think it's Gaijin Entertainment, which actually is a derogatory term. It means outsider in Japanese, and basically means it's a derogatory term for anyone that's not Japanese born. And so it's kind of weird that the development studio of this game is that word. Although from what I've heard, apparently the company might be Russian, and so they think it's like it's funny to use that as the word, as the name of the company. I don't know. But anyway, Blades of Time is the direct, the indirect, whatever you want to call it, sequel to X-Blades from a couple years back. Now, X-Blades was a game that I actually at one point was going to consider playing, but didn't have time at that period of time to play it, and it fell under my radar. Blades of Time follows Ayumi, who is the main protagonist. She is a swordsman, and she is supposedly a member of the Thieves Guild. The game starts out with her breaking into the Thieves Guild and stealing this orb of power from the guild master in an attempt to transport herself to a mythical world called the Dragon Isle. And, I'm sorry, the Dragon Land, and I believe there's a Dragon Isle somewhere in this Dragon Land. And so I guess the lore of the game is that there was some kind of a mythos, that there was some kind of a treasure or a power or some abstract thing that could be found in this Dragon Land, but the only way that you could get there is to get to this orb that the guild master was protecting. So Ayumi does it, gets inside, immediately realizes that everyone else who had invaded the guild with her isn't with her, and is greeted by this odd-looking avatar who almost looks identical to her, but actually has dragon wings and is basically made of fire. This avatar becomes her guide throughout the Dragonlands. And through Ayumi's adventure, she will go through several different locales, including a volcanic area, a jungle, a desert, a temple, a palace, all kinds of different areas that you can think of, all with their own environments, their own unique enemy sets, in an attempt to, number one, find some kind of abstract treasure. She doesn't know what it is. Number two, get the hell out of Dragonland, because she's actually stranded there and can't figure out how to get home. And throughout the course of the game, there's several characters that get involved, some side characters that kind of get involved halfway along the way. There are some twists at the end of the game. In fact, some interesting, really interesting plot things happen at the very end of the game, the last hour, that I think kind of make the story a little bit better. I thought it was pretty cool. But one thing that I do have to say is that the ending was a little bit confusing and a little bit just kind of like it stops. Like, this great cool ending sequence, and then it just kind of stops before there's a definitive ending to what happens with the game. And so, honestly, the story is pretty good, but at the same time is a little disappointing just because it doesn't really have a definitive ending, okay? I don't know if that means because they want to release DLC later. I don't know if it means they're going to make another sequel and it's going to continue straight on from this one. I have no idea. But, that being said, the plot isn't that bad. It's kind of interesting if you're following along, okay? The gameplay of Blades of Time. First of all, it's about an 8-hour-long game if you're talking the single-player campaign. There is an optional outbreak mode, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later on. It is a little bit weird, but we'll mention that in a couple minutes once we get to it. The single-player campaign is about 8 hours long, and it follows the story that I just described. Primarily, what are you going to be doing in Blades of Time? Well, you're going to be fighting enemies, and you can do this in many different ways. You can use melee attacks, which are either swinging your swords or kicking. Now, I don't know why they really call this button the kick button, because it's more of a launcher button, meaning if you press that button, you're going to launch the enemy into the air with, if you've ever played Street Fighter, you know how Guile has the flash kick? Well, that's pretty much what it is. Yumi does a flash kick, knocking your enemy into the air, which you can follow them up and juggle them for additional hits. As you progress throughout the course of the game, you also unlock different abilities. You can unlock things such as an area attack that like physically hurts everything in front of you. You can unlock an earthquake attack where she pounds the ground, and another area of effect attack where everything gets hurt. You can unlock freezing attacks that will lock your enemies in place for a temporary amount of time. Or incendiary attacks where you basically can set your enemies on fire. And as you kill enemies in the game, you will come across these areas in various stages of the game called altars, where you can trade in the experience points you've earned by killing enemies for new abilities. And really, from what I determined, is that you could play the game a little bit differently depending on what abilities you unlock. You could rely primarily on the magical elements. You can rely on the physical attacks, which is what I kind of did. I relied on what they call like the heavy damage attack or something like that. Or I think it was actually called the heavy strike. So it was more of a straightforward approach as opposed to trying to cast an ice spell and slowing all the enemies and then picking them off one by one. I would have the more direct approach, try to beat the shit out of them and do maximum damage as quickly as I can. In addition to all of those, I'd say about an hour into the game, you get an interesting mechanic, which is actually the reason why the game is called Blades of Time. It is the ability to rewind time for a set period of time, determined by a meter that recharges itself gradually, and basically create a clone of yourself. So you can play out 10 seconds of gameplay, then decide to all of a sudden rewind time, and so you'll rewind those 10 seconds of gameplay, and you can replay that gameplay from 10 seconds ago, but your already existing self goes off and does what you just did. So this is a really interesting element when it comes to different parts of the game. Maybe you're fighting an enemy that's tough, and really he regenerates his health, so it's really hard to kill him, but maybe, just maybe, if 2 or 3 of you were fighting him at once, you'd be able to take away enough of his energy that he would die. And so this is an interesting element where you can have one person fight, reset 10 seconds, a second clone will come around, now you have 2 people fighting him, reset again, third person comes around, fights them, and so 3 people at once are able to overcome this adversary. And there are several different enemies in the game that require this kind of combat. There's actually some particular adversaries that require you to use ranged attacks, which you actually find guns and ranged weapons throughout the course of the game. And you actually use the time aspect to possibly have 2, 3, even 4 of yourself shooting at a particular person at one time who may have like a special shield, and it overwhelms the shield breaks, and you're able to kill those opponents in that manner, which is really neat. Another aspect of the whole time manipulation are puzzles. There are actually certain puzzles in the game that require you to be on 2 places at exactly the same time. And so if you need to be stepping on 2 switches at the same time, obviously you can't do it in one time period, so you step on one switch, stay there for about 10 seconds, rewind all the way before you were even on that switch, walk your body over to the other switch, and now you're physically on both switches at the same time, and a door will open. And that constitutes pretty much a lot of the puzzles of the game. There are some other things that are more physical, like laser beams that kill you instantly, and so you have to jump and dash, because there are dashes and air dashes in the game. There are double jumps that make you basically get through certain areas. There's a lot of platforming in the game. It is a lot about jumping from platform to platform and surviving. There are a lot of instant deaths. And for the most part, the checkpoints are pretty good. I do have to say that there were a couple annoying checkpoints in the game where, like, there'd be a platforming area, you would die. So obviously the game expected that at one point you would die on these platforming areas, and it starts you off a full minute before the platforming area. So you have to kill one repetitive enemy, open one door, and then you start the platforming area over again. And the question is, why couldn't they just put the checkpoint right at the beginning of the platforming area? That's really weird that they did that, okay? Some other elements of the gameplay are treasure hunting, and what that means is you actually have a compass that at any time you can open up, and the compass will show you one of 2 things. It'll show you where you need to go for story progression in this world that you are, and it'll also point to if there's any nearby treasure. Now, treasures in this game are invisible, and you have this ability that's called, I believe it's called the Orb of Truth? No, I'm sorry, the Orb of Order, and it's used for 2 reasons. The first reason is, if you see something on your compass, oh, there's a treasure around here, you'll walk around looking for it. Eventually when you stumble upon it, it'll be kind of like a translucent treasure chest. You won't be able to touch it. But if you use this Orb of Order, all of a sudden, this treasure chest will be revealed and you'll be able to open it and get a treasure. Now, treasures are similar to role-playing games where you can equip them on your body and they have different effects. Some may make your fire spells more powerful. Some may make it so that you don't use as much energy when you decide to use your fire spell or something like that, okay? And I think it does need to be said that the way that you use your special attacks and abilities and even heal in this game is just by combat. Just by fighting enemies, you build up a couple different meters that will either allow you to cast a spell, do one of those heavy strike attacks, or actually heal yourself, okay? The time aspect is a completely separate meter that actually regenerates itself. So that one is the only one that's really a little bit separate from combat, okay? So all that being said, okay, there are some interesting things about the game, some things that I really enjoyed, and there are some really annoying things, some really odd design choices that I want to bring up. The things that I liked. Well, I definitely liked the variety of locales. The jungle, the volcano, the desert in particular. I really enjoyed the desert because the desert actually had a really unique puzzle mechanic where if you were in the sun was so strong that it drains your health. And so your goal is to get to the shade as quickly as possible and to solve puzzles so that you can actually move these shields in front of the sun, creating more shade so that you can get from point A to point B. It also had some really unique enemies that kind of came out of the sand, and I really enjoyed that as well. So I definitely enjoyed the variety of locales in the game. Some of the enemy fights are really interesting. There are some really unique enemies. For example, I did mention an enemy that regenerates his health. And if you just try to fight him straight up, you can't. You cannot beat him by yourself. You either need to completely overwhelm him with an army of time clones, or there's actually another interesting way that you can beat him, and what that is you hit him enough until he has a marker over his head, in which case you can press right bumper, or I believe it would probably be like R1 on the PlayStation 3 controller, and you'll go into this attack animation that holds him in place. While you're doing this, you can rewind time and have a clone of yours go behind him, which allows you to disable the backpack he has on that allows him to regenerate his health, and now he's vulnerable. Now you can beat the crap out of him and eventually kill him. So I liked those aspects that really took advantage of the time aspect of the game, whether it was a puzzle, whether it was a certain enemy. And some of the bosses as well. Some of the bosses traditionally in a game would be really hard to kill if you were by yourself. But once you realize, oh, that's right, this game's called Blades of Time. I can make clones of myself. You can actually overwhelm a lot of the bosses in the game and just beat them down after figuring out maybe one or two things. So in particular, there's this one boss near the end of the game who, first of all, has minions around him, and he regenerates his health by sucking it out of his minions. So the first thing you need to do is kill all the minions around him. Once you do that, he decides to fight you head up. And as you fight him, you start taking away his health, but then you realize you're never going to be able to take enough away of his health just by yourself, so you start creating clones of yourself to attack him and surround him and beat the crap out of him. And just after doing that several times, you're finally able to overwhelm this boss and beat him. So it's kind of like a multi-layered approach. You can't really just jump at a boss and beat him by punching him in the face. You actually have to use some of the unique abilities and things in the game that that are unique to the game in order to beat these bosses and monsters. The one thing that I think I haven't mentioned is that there is also the ability to kind of glide between certain areas. There are actually these things they call corals, which in any other game, like if you were playing Darksiders or if you were playing Zelda, it would be the hook that you use, either the hook shot or the chain to latch onto and to pull yourself across like gaps and chasms. In this game, they're called corals, and you could do the same kind of thing. So there is that kind of maneuverability in the game in certain areas of the game, and that actually is part of the puzzle solving as well. When you free up hidden corals that maybe you're stuck in ice or in rocks, and then they fly up, and you can use them to pull yourself from area to area. Okay. Some of the things that are really peculiar I didn't like. The combat itself is pretty damn repetitive. The only melee combat in the game is slashing with your sword and doing a launcher attack and then repeatedly slashing with the sword in the air. There's really no variety whatsoever to the melee combat. It's really about doing one combo with the melee and then figuring out, is that enough to kill the enemy, or do I need to create a clone of myself to do something special with this time aspect and beat the enemy. So for about 75% of the game, the combat is extremely repetitive, but it's that 25% where you have to be ingenious and use the time aspect to kill the enemies that actually shines. But the problem is, that is few and far between. A lot of the times the enemies are just generic mobs. You can just rush in and mash the buttons, and you end up killing the enemies, and that becomes really repetitive. Some of the puzzles are just oddly designed. Like, there's one particular puzzle where you have to use that orb of order that I told you about to actually light something like 8 torches around the top of a tower. But the tower has no sides, and so sometimes you're trying to hurry up and dash from torch to light them, and then you're using your time mechanic to have clones of yourself go light them all at the same time, and then oops, you fell off the side of the tower by accident, start the whole puzzle over. And it's so fucking frustrating during those times. Like, what the fuck? I gotta do this completely over. It's so frustrating. And it really is annoying. The voice acting. Now, this is probably the #1 negative in the entire game. Whoever it is that they had do the voice of a Yumi. First of all, she has this weird accent, and it's really hard to even place what kind of accent it's supposed to be. And her voice isn't annoying, let's put it that way. It's the fact that she's fucking talking constantly through the whole game that's annoying. It's like they recorded way too much dialogue for this girl. She always sounds like she's talking to herself. And it's really just obnoxious that, oh, you're running up a tower, oh no, there's going to be more enemies up here, and blah, 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 blah. Don't you ever shut up? Isn't there any period of time when you could just be like the quiet, stoic heroine and not be talking or blabbing about something? You don't have to fill every single moment of emptiness or silence with you blabbing, and that's really what it sounds like she's doing in this game with her narration. I don't know why they had her do that with the voice acting. Really freaking annoying. And then there are some really odd choices in game bugs. For example, Yumi's really freaking weak, meaning if any enemy hits her once or twice, she can die really quickly. Now the upside to this is she really gains the healing ability that she has very quickly as well. Usually by just killing one enemy, she can heal herself, which fills her whole life bar back up. But why does she die so easily? I mean, you want to feel powerful, you want to feel like this heroine who really is you know, interesting, a super powered warrior, and then one enemy will walk up behind you, bonk, you're dead, start from the checkpoint, and you're like, ugh. And the other thing was a couple really weird game bugs that I ran across while playing this game. And some people might say this has nothing to do with the game, but I have to say it does, okay? I played this game on Xbox 360, and as I was playing it, at one point during the game, my character froze in place, and I just couldn't move her. Nothing would happen. Nothing would respond. So what the fuck's going on? And I looked down, my controller was off, right in the middle of me playing. Now keep in mind, with the Xbox, if at any time your controller goes off, it's supposed to pop up with a message that says, your controller's been disconnected. Please reconnect controller 1 or whatever number controller you have in order to resume the game. It didn't do that. And actually twice during my playthrough, my controller just turned itself off. This has never happened to me ever in any game before where the batteries didn't die and my controller just turned off. Could it have been my controller? Possibly, but I'm just the weirdness that this is the only game this has ever happened, and the Xbox didn't realize that the controller was off makes me feel like it was a game bug, and that's really odd. There are a couple parts of the game where the frame rate will dip really low, and it will be hard for you to tell what's going on, and that's frustrating. And then there were a couple annoying game bugs, such as twice the game froze. Once, actually, during the final boss fight, I was just about to beat him. Well, it wasn't the final, it was the next to final boss fight. I was just about to beat him, and the console locked. It's so frustrating. You've been fighting this boss for 10 minutes, you figure out how to kill him, you're about to kill him, console locks, got to do the whole fight over. It's like, what the fuck, man? And the other bug, which was completely inexcusable and really weird, I was fighting a mini-boss in order to progress to the next part of the game. You had to kill this boss in order to progress to the next part. As I'm fighting the boss, he disappears completely. Now, I can't see him, but I could still hear him. And you could hear him yelling and screaming. He's coming out of my surround sound, but I can't see the guy. And I run around for about 5 minutes trying to figure out what to do, can't figure it out, and then my console locked again. So it's like, holy moly, like that is kind of a crazy game bug. Not only does a mini-boss that you need to kill to progress in the game disappear, but then the fucking console locks afterwards. So it's like, wow, this is really just like everything at once. So just really odd, a combination of some unique elements, some really interesting things going on with the time aspect, with a lot of the puzzles, with some of the abilities that you can get. Some of the locales, like I said, were really interesting. I actually did like the graphics, even though the frame rate did dip several times. But then combine that with some repetitive combat gameplay, about 75% of the time, really annoying voice acting, and some really kind of annoying game choices and game bugs. And I think what you get is an interesting game for maybe a rental, but not something that I could recommend that you would probably want to buy. The only other real replayability after you beat the game, because the game's about 8 hours long, after you beat it, there's a mode called Outbreak Mode. And this mode blows my mind. In my last part of the playthrough, if you want to see Outbreak Mode and what it's like, check it out, because I actually beat the game and said, let's go try Outbreak Mode for 10 minutes, and I did. It's nothing like the actual rest of the game. It's a separate mode that you can either play by yourself or online against another person, or actually with co-op as well. You could do two-player co-op with it, where it's almost like a tower defense game, where there's 3 maps and there's 2 teams, your team and the enemy team, which is like the monsters. And your goal is to destroy 3 towers that are on the map, okay, plus like a command center. And what happens is, at the beginning, you and a bunch of generic allies spawn, and you charge the other team, and you fight in the center of the map, and your goal is to destroy these towers one by one. Now, the towers actually shoot out missiles to defend themselves, and the enemies are obviously going to be protecting those towers as well. As a tower depletes and gets destroyed, less enemies can spawn from the base. So it's in your best interest to try to ransack those towers, because then you're going to have less enemies coming out of the base. And it's really odd, because number one, it's nothing like that in the single player campaign. It seems like something that they just created completely independent of it. Number two, it's like, why would you have that in this game? I can understand if you said we wanted to put some online play in it, but why design a mode that's so different from the gameplay of the actual single player campaign? It just baffles my mind. Now, when you die during this campaign, or during this Outbreak Mode, you respawn, and when you respawn, every time that you respawn, you get to unlock a new ability for your character. So technically, every time you die, you get stronger, but at the same time, you have a limited amount of times that you can die and respawn. And once you do it, I think 10 times, the game is over. So you have to destroy all your enemies and their entire base by the time that, you know, you die 10 times. And it's just so weird and confusing to me that this is part of the game. Like, it blows my mind. Could you potentially say this adds replayability? Yeah, but I'd have to say not for Blades of Time, because it really has nothing to do. It's almost like a mini-game mode that they threw on here to say that the game had some kind of online play. And we've seen this a lot with games recently. Ninja Gaiden 3 was one of them. Had online play that really wasn't anything significant. Why was it there? Probably so they could just say, my game has online play and some replayability. So really confusing. Does it add value? I'd say a little bit, but I can't really realistically see many people getting into it so much that they would want to play this, you know, competitively or anything like that, unless you have a friend or two who owns the game and you want to play it. I'd really say the only reason to play it is because there's a set of achievements and or trophies that you unlock just by playing that mode. So if you want to get all the trophies or achievements of the game, you have to play that mode. But outside of that, I can't tell you why you would want to play that mode. It's really odd. So, for me, Blades of Time is a mixed bag. It's a game that definitely I think a lot of people missed out on, swept under the rug, or went under their radars, because it came out during a series of weeks when you had some really good games coming out. Like you had Mass Effect 3, you had Silent Hill Downpour, you had Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, Ninja Gaiden 3, you had other games that people were kind of anticipating. And even though those games, a lot of them weren't particularly good, people still went out and got those over this one, and I think this one got overlooked, which is a shame, because in my opinion, I had fun playing the game. I would definitely recommend it as like a weekend rental if you have 2 or 3 days to really sink your teeth into it. It's definitely worth playing through at least once. And being that it is an 8-hour-long game, the length of the campaign isn't too bad. And it does have that optional mode, that Outbreak Mode, even though it is really weird, it does add some value. I'm going to give Blades of Time a 6 out of 10, okay? And keep in mind, I know I say this in almost every single Hateful Truth review, but my reviews are a lot more strict than a lot of other, gaming media. You know, a lot of times they give points away for no reason. I don't know why. I think this game is slightly above average because of the reasons I mentioned, especially the time aspect of it and the puzzle aspect of it, and a couple really cool boss fights and a couple really cool locales and stages and puzzles, but not enough to be like a must-buy or a must-get. You know, maybe a fun weekend rental, but that's about it in my opinion. So that's been it for the Hateful Truth this time around. Maximum truth, minimum bullshit. Remember, I cut through all the bullshit and I'm honest with you guys. And that's it for this time around. I hope now you know a lot more about Blades of Time, a game that most people didn't even know about, and you know whether or not you'd like to try it out, whether as a buy or a rental, although I recommend a rental. And I will see you next time on the Hateful Truth video game review series. Thanks a lot.